Hello, everyone. So, this is the second part of a three-part series. We have ourselves the introduction, which you've just watched. This is the second part of the series, which is about body paragraphs. And the third one will be about conclusions. So, body paragraphs are extremely important in any essay because they are in the middle and they're the largest portion of the essay. An introduction should only be one paragraph in this class, and the conclusion should only be one paragraph in this class. Therefore, when you're writing a three-page paper, everything you're going to focus on will be on these sort of longer paragraphs. And I mentioned that they should be 8 to 12 sentences, ideally. Originally, I put 8 to 10, but you can put it up to 12. I think anything more than 12 usually means that you're starting a new body paragraph. Okay, and typically in a five paragraph essay, you have three main ideas, which in this case equals three body paragraphs. So I just want to go back really quickly here, and I just highlighted this in advance. These were my main ideas: racial barriers, invisible walls, and stereotypes. So I'm going to do something here. I'm going to basically spell out this is body paragraph one for me. I know that this is going to be my first body paragraph. Invisible walls. This is body paragraph 2. So you want to take note of this because this is essentially the main ideas that you're listing. You're going to put this in the same exact order in your actual essay. So I got three body paragraphs, and in the essay sample, I provided one. The first one, which is racial prejudice. All right. So in a body paragraph, you are going to mix a little bit of summary with analysis, with content, right? So this can be a little bit hard, but once you get used to it, it gets a lot easier. So the first thing you need to do is the topic sentence. The essential question here is, I'll write this down for you. What is this paragraph about in one sentence? Make it simple, make it easy, make it sweet. What is this body paragraph about? And notice that I used the term racial prejudice, and up here I put racial barriers. I'm just saying that this is another way of promoting racial barriers as racial prejudice. So I made it clear this is exactly what my paragraph is going to be about. So you want to write this down. The very first word in your topic sentence should be your main objective, which is why outlining is so important. Because when you outline, if you have the three main ideas, and let's say you had a very bordered world, and then you put borders as physical embodiments, boundaries as invisible embodiments, you would put in the very first body paragraph physical barriers, physical borders are very important because. So does that make sense? So that's why the outlining process is so useful because you can literally just plug in and play. Now, here's something that I want you to recognize, which is in your essay and in the topic sentence, you need to connect it to other topic sentences. So I'm going to give you an example here. While racial prejudice creates an invisible border, this is a new body paragraph, right? It is also important, also important to recognize. Now I'm going to use the same exact words that I used up here. I might even copy and paste it. Invisible walls. Okay, so in this example, notice that I put in the, I'm going to put body paragraph 1. I'm going to call it BP, topic sentence 1. And this would be body paragraph 2, topic sentence 2. So that way you kind of get an idea, right? You want to always keep in mind that you want to remind the reader of what the previous paragraph was about, but also what the next thing is that you're talking about and the connection between them. If you can do this in the topic sentence, you're well on your way to becoming very successful because it really helps with organization. Because you have to remember a teacher, and this is not just for me, right? This is going to be for any teacher. I have 45 students in the class. I get lost all the time. And that's the last thing you want the teacher to do is get lost. Instead, you want to keep them on a certain point, a certain trajectory, and this is exactly the way to do it. You remind the reader, paragraph by paragraph, it's like connecting the dots. Don't let some of these dots go missing. Make sure they're all connected. That will make it so much stronger, so much stronger. Okay, so this next thing here, give context, background information to paragraph and quote. Don't analyze yet. Add the author's last name, the title of the essay slash story. This is very important because this is your first time introducing an article, especially in body paragraph 1. In body paragraph 2, you can have a little bit more fun. You can use the term it in body paragraph 2 if you are using the same exact um, essay or story, right? But if you are switching, then you want to make clear um, the next essay that you're using, the next author. And you also want to say something about credibility. So, for example, in Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, he talks about his time in Burma as a soldier who must act like judge, executioner, but also as a puppet. He knows exactly how things are because he feels it at a time when this is deemed normal. You could say the reason why this is important is because he's experiencing this and he's relating it as best he can. And of course, no one's perfect, right? But for example, why should I trust the person who wrote Borders, a very short introduction? Is this person credible? Do they teach at a certain school? Do they have a certain field of expertise? Are border studies their sort of expertise? So, giving information and background information that you think is essential for having the reader say, you know what, this evidence I'm about to read is exactly what I need to know. It's all about having them exactly knowing what it is that they need to know. Anything that you think the reader needs to know, put it in there. I would say this though, when you are adding context, do not overdo it. I would say 1 to 2 sentences is more than enough. In this case, I have about 2 to 3 sentences, which is a little bit long, but because this body paragraph is a little bit longer, I could kind of get away with it. But in most cases, you don't need to put an entire paragraph just to context. I had a student last semester that was like, they basically listed all these things that happened in the essay. Your job is not to summarize the entire essay, it's just to give me a certain bit of information that you think is necessary for me to know that this is evidence that's worth my time, right? So, now let's move on. Next thing, introducing a quote. Cannot stress this enough. The easiest way to do this is to put the author writes, Orwell states. If it's an interview, um, the interviewer replies, the interviewee uh, says. So anything that kind of lets the reader know here comes the evidence. It literally leads you into the fact that you're about to give some form of evidence. So this is very important. There's multiple ways of doing this, but I prefer the simplest way, which is just to put down a noun of some sort, the person, love, someone, something, writes, says, does, speaks, replies, anything like that. So that way I know that this is about to be a quote. Okay, now I cannot stress this enough. Some people are worried about creating quotes and evidence. Some people prefer to use personal experiences as forms of evidence. But because this is a college level course and I want you to get used to what we call academic discourse, the way that you speak, the way that you write should be more based on the evidence from quotes that you've read in the book rather than your own personal experiences. In other words, don't try to make stuff up. Don't try to add personal experiences as the examples. Instead, use the readings that I've given you as your form of evidence. It's right there in front of me and for you. And now that you know that, now that you have some form of quote or evidence from the book, you insert it into the essay. Now, next week I'm going to talk into more detail about how you can integrate and add different kinds of evidence, but here's what you do need to know. Um, you need to find something, this is very important. You need to find something where you could write a minimum, and I say minimum, of 3 sentences after a quote. And it has to be directly taken from the quote. So this is what I mentioned this before in module one, what I call re-quoting, right? And I talked about this in level two reading and level two writing. And what analysis here means is I have evidence in front of you and I'm going to explain what was in my head and put it on a piece of paper. So this is a very long quote. I don't want to downplay it. This would probably be a little bit too long for you, especially an essay of 3 to 4 pages. So you might want to make it a little bit shorter than that if you were to use something this long. But here's what we call analysis, okay? And this is the bread and butter of how you're going to be successful in this class. First off, you need to examine the quote. And I mentioned this earlier in the reading process. What are certain words and phrases that stand out to you? The very first one that I find is sea of yellow faces. And another one was that uh, excited over this bit of fun. All certain that this elephant was going to be shot. That's another one for me. They were watching me as they would watch a conjurer about to perform a trick. They did not like me. Oh, yes, that's very important. But with the magical rifle, notice that he uses that adjective. Great for creative writing, not so good for essay writing. In my hands, I was momentarily worth watching. Oops, sorry. And I suddenly realized I should have to shoot the elephant after all. Okay, and now note here that I've highlighted these, and notice I didn't highlight the entire sentence, right? People have a tendency to write the entire sentence. What you can do is break this up, right? About to is not something I really need. So I am going to try to get rid of that. So that way, when I put it down here in the analysis, which I'm circling around here, I will be able to evaluate and interpret it. So now that I know some of the words and phrases that stand out to me, I want to explain why they are important to me, and I want you, the reader, to pay attention now. So this is what I call evaluating and interpreting. Okay? So Orwell discusses how the sea of yellow faces. So notice that I put these in quotation marks. And I cannot stress this enough, every time you get something that is from a quote, put it in quotation marks, unless if you're paraphrasing it. In this case, when it comes to analysis, do not paraphrase. Instead, stick to the actual quote. Orwell discusses how the sea of yellow faces expect him to pull the trigger. And I want to talk about the fact that he uses the word yellow, right? Which is meant to be sort of this sort of overwhelming feeling of people watching him, but also it's a reference to the color of their skin, which leads to invisible barriers, right? Because he doesn't even realize what he's saying may be racially prejudiced, because at the time it may have been more acceptable then than it is now to say something like this, right? So he doesn't even recognize. So the invisible barrier, or excuse me, the invisible wall is already there. It's already there, but he doesn't see it, right? So I'm kind of making this clear to the reader. Normally, in regular life, they did not like him, but with the magical rifle, he is suddenly, and I should have put, um, momentarily worth watching. That is, now notice this is my sort of what I call explanation, right? So there's additional words and additional phrases and things that people need to know. I'm going to explain them after I do the requoting. So I start with requoting, I go directly from the quote, and after that, I'm going to kind of expand it to larger ideas about invisible walls, which I'll explain in a second. That is when he realizes he should have to shoot the elephant after all, because the border is temporarily broken in that moment. Therefore, he must do it. In this case, I could have even put, I could have done more requoting here. He should shoot the elephant after all. That is when he realizes even those in power are powerless against the strength and control over others. And here's where I could add something about invisible walls, right? Uh, he he does not even recognize the invisible walls and racial prejudice in his words. In this quote, he also realizes that this is no longer about him, but about something much greater. So this is what I call explaining further, and I'm going to put that on the side here. Explain concepts further. So once you have requoted and you're done with that part, right? So requoting, first part. Next thing you need to do is explain the concepts further. If there's anything that you think needs to be added, put it in, insert it. Do not let your reader, what we call, go away empty handed. You do not want the reader to guess what it is that you are saying. You want to make it as clear as possible, crystal clear, right? I noticed that some of you have said in your English 101 questionnaire that you think a good writer is someone who can make up mental images and help people understand things. That's great for creative writing. Instead, for essay writing, instead of creating a mental picture in their head, what you want to be able to do is make your ideas clear to the reader. That's the most important. I'm going to say that again. You want to make your ideas clear to the reader. You want to make it known this is what you think, this is what you've studied, here's what you came up with, done. You don't have to be like, uh, oh, well, the way that he describes and blah, 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 blah. You don't have to go into great detail about explaining concepts alone. I noticed that a lot of students tend to have a tendency to explain concepts further, but they do not do things like requoting. And this is very important because I think if you were able to explain what's in your mind, especially in a quote, and then you bring it back to the reader and you let them know, this is what I'm thinking. I'm going to make it as clear as possible to you as I can. That is going to be an A-level essay. If you are missing some marks, or if you're not really doing requoting, you're probably going to end up with a B or a C um, in terms of the body paragraphs, right? And you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. So make it as clear as possible by requoting and always explaining any concepts that you need. Finally, and this is very important, I'm sure many of you have felt this before. People oftentimes don't know how to transition from one paragraph to another. This has been my best way to do it, and so I teach it and I expect it of my students because not only is it easier for you, it's also easier for me. It tends to work 99% of the time. So the last thing that you need to do and this is the easiest way to transition from one paragraph to another. There's only one thing that holds this paper together. Does anyone know what it is? Thesis, thesis, thesis. The thesis statement is going to be the best way to connect one idea to another. Every body paragraph is going to relate back to the thesis, right? So this is why I call it the transition to your thesis. You can call it whatever you want. I like to call it relate because what you're doing is I should actually say, relate your body paragraph to the thesis. Make it clear. What does this body paragraph have to do with the thesis? What is the connection between the two? Let's see here. Therefore, notice I use the word therefore. Great way to put a final word on this body paragraph. This indicates to the reader, and it does to me, the moment I read this, I know this is going to be the last sentence of this body paragraph. Therefore, Orwell shows that racial prejudices cause ripples in the will and belief that you have dominion or control over others. In other words, borders create a false sense of control. This goes back to my thesis about borders that leads to hurting others despite their best intentions. So again, let's go look at my thesis really quickly. I want to just go back to this here. Okay. Although personal boundaries are necessary, it is important to consider the walls they put up around them and why they are doing it. If these walls are broken down, it can help alter the shape in which our minds shape ourselves in the future. So, for example, if Orwell recognizes these things, then now, now he becomes more self-aware, which is good for him, but it also will help in terms of changing the perceptions of racial prejudice that are, it seems to be inherently in this essay to begin with, right? So, what I'm trying to say here is that when you relate your body paragraph back to the thesis, you make it as crystal clear as possible. Your paragraph is ended. Now you're going to talk about your next idea, which of course relates to the thesis, which is invisible walls. And again, when you look at the sample paper, you will see that. Okay, I'm out for now. I'm going to talk about conclusions next.